The first time Emily sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, I forgot how to breathe. Not because I was nervous in the way people usually imagine, not because there was anything romantic or dramatic about the moment. It was because for nearly 2 years I had become an expert at keeping my distance from her, and in one quiet second every careful habit I had built suddenly disappeared. She looked directly into my eyes with a calm expression that somehow carried months of unanswered questions. "Tell me why you keep avoiding me." The room became so still that even the old clock above the kitchen doorway seemed to pause between ticks. I wanted to answer. Instead, I stared at the mug warming my hands and wished there were words simple enough to explain something that had never been simple at all. People often assume avoiding someone means you dislike them. Sometimes it means you admire them so much that you're afraid of disappointing them. My name is Nathan Carter, and by the time I turned 26, I had become very good at disappearing whenever life became too personal. It wasn't because I hated people. Quite the opposite. I cared too deeply. I had learned early that people eventually left, changed, or became too busy. So instead of waiting for disappointment, I quietly stepped back before anyone noticed how much they mattered to me. That habit followed me everywhere, especially into the small brick house I shared with my roommate, Oliver Hughes. Oliver and I had met during university while volunteering at a local community garden. We became friends over muddy boots, broken wheelbarrows, and countless afternoons helping elderly neighbors grow vegetables they could no longer manage alone. Oliver possessed the rare ability to become friends with nearly everyone. He laughed loudly. He trusted easily. He believed problems could usually be solved with tea, patience, and enough conversation. "You think too much," he often told me. "And you don't think enough," I would reply. Then we'd both laugh because somehow we were both right. 2 years after graduating, we rented a modest home together near the edge of town. Life settled into a comfortable routine. Oliver worked as a physiotherapy assistant. I restored antique furniture for a small family workshop that valued craftsmanship over speed. Neither of us earned much, but we earned enough. The house wasn't impressive. The kitchen cupboard squeaked, the fence leaned slightly, the garden grew more weeds than flowers. Still, it felt like home. It also meant I occasionally met Oliver's family. His parents visited every few months, his younger cousins arrived during school holidays, and sometimes his older sister, Emily Hughes, stopped by carrying homemade bread or fresh biscuits she insisted she had baked by accident. No one accidentally baked 3 dozen biscuits. Emily simply enjoyed taking care of people. She was 30, worked as a librarian, and somehow remembered everything: birthdays, favorite books, the name of your childhood dog, the fact that you prefer strawberry jam over raspberry. She noticed details most people overlooked. Perhaps that was why I tried not to spend too much time around her. Not because she made me uncomfortable, because she made me feel seen, and I wasn't used to that. The first year one knew her, our conversations remained brief. She'd ask about work, I'd answer politely. She'd recommend a novel, I'd promise to read it. Then I'd quietly find an excuse to leave the room. Oliver never seemed to notice. Emily probably did, but she was too kind to mention it. Months passed. Whenever Oliver invited his family for Sunday lunch, I'd volunteer to collect groceries. If Emily arrived unexpectedly, I'd suddenly remember an errand. If everyone watched a film together, I'd claim paperwork needed finishing. None of those excuses were entirely false. They simply weren't the real reason. The truth was harder to admit. Emily reminded me of the sort of person I wished I could become: patient, steady, present. She listened without interrupting. She encouraged without controlling. She made every conversation feel important. Being around someone like that forced me to notice how often I hid behind silence. One autumn afternoon, everything almost changed. Oliver had been called into work unexpectedly, leaving me alone to wait for a delivery. Around noon, someone knocked. Emily stood outside holding 2 paper bags. "I made soup," she said. "I think you made enough for a football team." "I always do," she smiled. I remembered Oliver mentioned you've been working late. I stepped aside. "Come in." She placed the containers on the kitchen counter. "You look tired." "I've been sanding oak tables all week." "That explains the sawdust in your hair." I reached up immediately. She laughed softly. "It's already gone." For nearly an hour we talked. Not about anything remarkable. Books, local cafe tilde copyright S, community events, favorite childhood memories. For reasons I couldn't explain, conversation with Emily never felt forced. She didn't ask difficult questions. She simply gave silence enough room that answers appeared naturally. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the door. Nathan? Yes, you don't have to disappear every time I visit. Heat rushed into my face. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. She smiled kindly. I haven't done anything to make you uncomfortable, have I? Then perhaps next time you'll stay for dessert. Before I could answer, she was already walking down the garden path. That evening I spent far too long thinking about those words. You don't have to disappear. Yet I did, again and again. Winter arrived, then spring. Life continued, until Oliver injured his ankle during the weekend charity football match. Nothing serious, just enough to keep him off his feet for several weeks. Naturally, Emily visited more often to help. She brought meals, collected groceries, watered the neglected garden. Sometimes she'd stay only 10 minutes. Other days she'd remain for hours, making sure Oliver actually rested instead of pretending he felt fine. I adjusted my schedule around her visits whenever possible. It became almost automatic. If I heard her car outside, I'd suddenly remember something needing attention in the workshop. If I couldn't leave, I'd retreat upstairs. Oliver eventually noticed. You know, he said one evening while balancing awkwardly on crutches, Emily thinks you don't like her. The screwdriver slipped from my hand. What? I told her she's imagining things. I don't dislike her. Then why'd you vanish? I've just been busy. He raised an eyebrow. Busier every time she arrives? I had no answer. Oliver sighed. My sister likes you. My heart skipped before he continued. As a friend. I exhaled quietly. She thinks you're thoughtful. She's mistaken. He smiled. She says you're the kind of person who notices when someone else is carrying too much. I looked away. She's giving me too much credit. She also says you look lonely. That sentence lingered in the room long after Oliver changed the subject. Lonely? I'd never described myself that way, yet somehow hearing someone else see it made it impossible to ignore. The following Saturday, I decided to stay home instead of escaping to the workshop. It felt like a small act of courage. Emily arrived carrying flowers for the kitchen. She announced, "They'll brighten the place." Oliver grinned. "They'll distract people from Nathan's terrible cooking. My cooking is perfectly acceptable." Emily laughed. "I've never actually tried it." "There's a reason." "Oliver," she gently nudged her brother's shoulder, "I thought families were supposed to be supportive." "We are," Oliver replied. "We're supporting him by encouraging takeaway." For the first time in months, I stayed through the entire afternoon. We played an old board game, shared tea, argued playfully over impossible crossword clues. Nothing extraordinary happened, yet I realized something surprising. Being around Emily wasn't exhausting. Pretending I wasn't comfortable around her was. As evening approached, she helped gather empty cups from the table. "I've missed this," she said quietly. "What?" "Talking to you." I hesitated. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For disappearing." She looked thoughtful rather than offended. I wondered if I'd said something wrong. "You never did." "Then why?" I searched for an answer, one honest enough without revealing everything. "I've always been better with furniture than people." She smiled. "Furniture doesn't answer back." "Exactly. Neither do books." "Which explains your career." She laughed. "And yours." For a moment, everything felt wonderfully easy. Then my phone rang. The workshop manager needed help with an urgent delivery. I left almost immediately. Old habits always found convenient excuses. Over the next few weeks, I noticed something different. Emily stopped trying quite so hard. She remained warm, kind, friendly, but she no longer invited conversation beyond polite greetings. She seemed to accept that I preferred distance. Oddly enough, that hurt more than I expected. One Friday evening I returned home to find Oliver cooking dinner. "You're late." "I know." He stirred the saucepan thoughtfully. "Emily was here." "Oh." She asked if she'd done something. I froze. "What did you tell her?" "The truth." "Which truth?" "That I don't understand you." I rubbed my forehead. "Neither do I." Oliver switched off the stove and leaned against the counter. "Nathan, my sister doesn't expect perfection." "I know." "She isn't judging you." "I know." "So what are you afraid of?" The question settled heavily between us. Finally I answered. My father used to promise he'd come to my school concerts. Oliver stayed silent. He always meant it. I continued, but work became more important. Sometimes he'd arrive after everyone had gone home. I swallowed carefully. Eventually I stopped expecting him. Oliver nodded. When people matter to me, I struggled to continue. I start assuming I'll disappoint them eventually, so I leave first. The words sounded painfully small when spoken aloud. Oliver walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. Emily isn't keeping score. I know. Then perhaps stop punishing yourself for mistakes you haven't made. That night I barely slept. His words echoed through every restless hour. Stop punishing yourself. Perhaps I had been doing exactly that, not only with Emily, with everyone. I thought about every invitation declined, every friendship kept safely distant, every conversation ended too soon because vulnerability felt dangerous. The next morning, I decided something had to change, not dramatically, just one small step. I visited the bakery Emily often mentioned. I bought a loaf of fresh sourdough and the lemon biscuits she loved recommending. Then I walked to the library. Halfway there I almost turned back 3 times. Each excuse sounded convincing. She'd be busy. This would seem strange. Maybe tomorrow. But tomorrow had become my favorite hiding place. Inside the library, sunlight filtered through tall windows, filling the quiet space with a warm golden glow. Emily stood behind the front desk helping an elderly gentleman find large print mystery novels. She smiled with the same patience she seemed to offer everyone. When she noticed me waiting, surprise briefly crossed her face. "Nathan, I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." She finished assisting the gentleman before walking over. "What brings you here?" I held up the paper bag awkwardly. "A peace offering." She blinked. "For?" "I've been avoiding someone who didn't deserve it." A gentle silence settled between us. Then she accepted the bag with both hands. "I was beginning to think you simply didn't like libraries." "I do. I've just never been brave enough to visit." She tilted her head. "I don't think the library was what frightened you." Before I could respond, the front door chimed again as another visitor stepped inside. Emily looked toward the entrance, then back at me. "I finish work in an hour." I nodded. "I'll wait." She smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that reached her eyes. "Good." I found a chair beside the history shelves, opened the nearest book, and tried to read. Instead, I spent the next hour wondering whether this conversation might finally become the beginning of the honesty both of us had quietly waited for. The hour passed more slowly than I expected, though for the first time in a long while I didn't feel the urge to escape. The library carried its own quiet rhythm. Pages turned gently. Children whispered excitedly as they searched for adventure stories. An elderly couple compared gardening books as though choosing treasures. Emily moved from shelf to shelf with calm confidence, greeting every visitor by name whenever she could. Watching her work explained something I had never fully understood. She wasn't simply kind, she made people feel important. When a teenager nervously asked for help finding information about apprenticeships, Emily listened with complete attention instead of rushing him along. When an older woman admitted she'd forgotten her reading glasses, Emily patiently read the book descriptions aloud without making her feel embarrassed. No conversation seemed too small. No person seemed inconvenient. I realized that kindness wasn't something Emily switched on when she felt generous. It was simply who she was. At 5 o'clock she locked the front doors, straightened a stack of returned books, and walked toward me with the same warm smile she'd worn all afternoon. "I hope you weren't terribly bored. I've restored chairs that were less peaceful than this place." She laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It definitely is." She picked up her coat. "There's a little cafe copy right around the corner." "I know the one. They make dreadful coffee." "Then why suggest it?" "The owner bakes wonderful apple cake." I smiled. "That sounds like a fair compromise." The cafe copyright was only a short walk away. It wasn't fashionable or particularly modern. The chairs didn't match. The menus had faded corners. Fresh flowers sat on every table, and someone had written a handwritten quote near the entrance. "Happiness grows where kindness is planted." Emily noticed me reading it. "Mrs. Palmer changes the quote every Monday." "Does she always choose hopeful ones?" "I think she believes people carry enough worries before they walk through the door." We ordered tea and 2 slices of apple cake. For several minutes we simply enjoyed the quiet. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence. Eventually Emily folded her hands around her cup. So, you brought me bread and biscuits. I did. You apologized. I did. But I still don't think you've told me the real reason. I stared into my tea. I was afraid. Of me? Number. I smiled faintly. Never of you. Then what? I searched for words that felt honest instead of dramatic. You ever meet someone who reminds you of the person you wish you were? She looked puzzled. I don't think anyone's ever described me that way. I have. She waited. You remember everything. You care about people. You make time. You notice when someone's struggling before they admit it. I shook my head gently. I've spent years convincing myself that keeping people at a distance protects everyone. Emily didn't interrupt. My father loved our family. I continued quietly. He truly did. But he was always chasing one more promotion, one more project, one more responsibility. When he was home, he was exhausted. When he missed important moments, he apologized sincerely. I smiled sadly. He wasn't a bad man. He simply believed there would always be another chance. Emily nodded. I grew up promising myself I'd never disappoint people the way he accidentally disappointed us. And somewhere along the way, I sighed. I decided the safest way to avoid disappointing anyone was not to let them expect much from me. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she asked the simplest question imaginable. Has that worked? I looked around the cafe. Copyright. The answer sat quietly between us. Number. What has it given you? Loneliness. And what has it taken? I thought about birthdays I'd skipped, neighbors I'd never truly known, conversations abandoned before they could become friendships. It took more than I realized. Emily smiled gently. I suspected that. You did. You always looked like someone standing outside a warm house because you were worried about bringing mud onto the carpet. I blinked. That's strangely accurate. My grandmother used to say something similar. What? She believed some people spent so much energy trying not to become a burden that they accidentally robbed others of the joy of caring for them. I sat quietly. That sentence landed somewhere deep inside me. She continued softly. Do you know what I thought every time you disappeared? I shook my head. I wondered whether I'd said something insensitive. I replayed conversations in my head. I worried I'd made you uncomfortable. My stomach tightened. I never meant that. I know. She smiled reassuringly. I don't think you ever intended to hurt anyone, but intentions don't always erase confusion. I'm sorry. I know. She reached across the table, not dramatically, just enough to rest her fingertips slightly beside my hand without touching it. Thank you for telling me. No judgment, no lecture, just gratitude. That somehow made the apology feel complete. When we left the cafe. Copyright. The evening sun painted long golden shadows across the pavement. Neither of us seemed eager to hurry home. Walk through the park? Emily asked. I'd like that. Children chased footballs across the grass while parents chatted from nearby benches. An elderly man fed ducks by the pond. A volunteer group planted colorful flowers near the entrance. Life continued in dozens of quiet moments all around us. Emily slowed near a newly planted oak tree. See that plaque? I leaned closer. It read, "A tree grows because someone believed the future mattered." I like that, I said. So do I. She smiled. Small things become big things eventually. I nodded thoughtfully. Friendships probably work the same way. They do. As we continued walking, she asked about my workshop, not just what I built, why I enjoyed restoring old furniture. I told her about discovering beauty hidden beneath damaged varnish, about repairing chairs that everyone else believed were beyond saving, about the satisfaction of preserving something meaningful instead of replacing it. Emily listened carefully. You know what? You restore more than furniture. I do. You restore history. She pointed toward an old oak bench. Every scratch tells a story. You make sure those stories survive. I'd never thought about my work that way. She noticed my expression. Someone once helped me see libraries differently. How? I thought I was organizing books. She smiled. My mentor said I was protecting people's memories. For several minutes we simply walked. The conversation no longer felt like two people cautiously learning about one another. It felt like two old friends finally catching up after wasting too much time. When we reached the house, Oliver looked up from watering the garden. Well, he grinned broadly. I was beginning to think one of you had moved overseas. Emily rolled her eyes. We had tea, for 3 hours. There was also cake. Oliver looked at me. So that's where all the courage went. I laughed, a real laugh, perhaps the first genuine one he'd heard from me in weeks. The days that followed felt different, not because everything changed overnight, because little things began changing consistently. Instead of eating dinner alone in my room, I joined Oliver downstairs. When neighbors organized the weekend cleanup of the local playground, I volunteered. Emily occasionally stopped by after work, and for once I stayed. Conversation became easier each visit. Not perfect, just honest. One Saturday the three of us helped repaint the community center fence. Children ran around with tiny paintbrushes pretending to supervise. Parents served sandwiches from folding tables. Retired builders offered advice nobody had requested but everyone appreciated anyway. Near lunchtime an elderly volunteer named Mr. Bennett struggled to lift a heavy planter. I hurried over. So did Emily. We both reached it at exactly the same time. Mr. Bennett chuckled. I appear to have recruited 2 helpers instead of 1. After setting the planter down, he smiled at us. You know what keeps communities alive? I expected him to mention funding, or volunteers. Instead he said, people who notice. He pointed toward a young father trying unsuccessfully to entertain his restless daughter while painting. Someone notices. A teenager immediately walked over carrying crayons. He nodded toward another volunteer whose shoelace had come undone while carrying supplies. Someone quietly knelt to tie it before the older gentleman lost his balance. Kindness, Mr. Bennett said, usually begins with paying attention. Emily looked at me knowingly. I've heard something similar before. So have I replied. That afternoon changed something inside me, not because of any grand event, because I began seeing what Emily had always seen, small opportunities, tiny acts, simple moments where choosing kindness required almost no effort, helping carry groceries, holding doors, remembering names, listening fully. None of it made newspaper headlines, yet all of it quietly strengthened the people around us. A week later the workshop received an unusual commission. The old chapel outside town needed several antique pews restored before its anniversary celebration. The project would take weeks. I happily accepted. When Emily heard about it, she surprised me. I'd love to see the chapel. Really? I've never been inside. The following Saturday we drove there together. The building stood on a gentle hill surrounded by ancient trees. Inside, sunlight streamed through colorful stained glass windows, filling the wooden floor with patches of blue, red, and gold. Emily walked slowly between the pews. It's beautiful. It needs a great deal of work. So do most worthwhile things. I smiled. I suppose that's true. While I examined damaged wood, Emily wandered quietly around the room. Eventually she stopped beside a faded notice board displaying photographs from decades earlier. Families, choirs, harvest celebrations, wedding anniversaries, community dinners. She studied them for a long time. What are you thinking? I asked. These people probably believed their ordinary Saturdays would be forgotten. She gestured toward the photographs, but someone cared enough to remember. I looked around the chapel differently after that, not as a building, as thousands of shared moments held together by kindness. Before leaving, we found a small notebook where visitors could write messages. Emily picked up the pen. What should we write? I thought carefully before answering. Thank you for preserving places where people remember they belong. She smiled. I like that. On the drive home neither of us spoke much. Comfortable silence had replaced awkward silence. There was an enormous difference. As evening settled across the countryside, Emily looked out the window before quietly saying something that stayed with me long after we reached home. You know, Nathan. Yes, I never needed you to become someone different. She smiled warmly. I just hoped one day you'd let people know the person you already were. I didn't answer immediately, because for the first time in years, I was beginning to believe that person might actually be worth knowing. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet steadiness that felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. Nothing extraordinary happened. There were no dramatic turning points or life-changing announcements. Instead, there were dozens of ordinary days. And for the first time in years I stopped treating ordinary as something to hurry through. One Monday morning I arrived at the workshop to find my employer, Graham Ellis, standing beside an old writing desk that looked as though it had traveled through several generations. He smiled when he saw me. "This one's special." I ran my hand gently across the worn timber. "The joints are loose." "They are. The finish has almost disappeared." "It has. The drawers don't close properly." He folded his arms. "Can it be saved?" I looked more carefully. The frame was tired, but not broken. The wood still had strength beneath years of neglect. "It deserves to be." Graham nodded with quiet satisfaction. "I thought you'd say that." As I spent the following days restoring the desk, I found myself thinking less about wood and more about people. Time leaves marks on everyone. Some marks are visible, others are hidden beneath polite smiles and ordinary conversations. Yet damage is not the same thing as defeat. Given patience, care and hope, remarkable things can be restored. That thought stayed with me. One evening, after work, Oliver suggested we attend the monthly neighborhood supper held at the community center. A few months earlier I would have invented an excuse. This time I picked up my coat. "I'll come." Oliver stared at me dramatically. "Should I check whether you've been replaced by an unusually friendly twin?" I laughed. Then miracles really do happen. The community hall buzzed with cheerful conversation. Long tables were covered with homemade meals. Children carried plates almost too large for their hands. Retired couples chatted with university students as though they'd known each other for years. Emily waved when she saw us. "You made it." I said I would. "I know," she smiled. "I'm just glad you believed yourself." That sentence made me pause. There had been plenty of promises in my life. The hardest ones to keep were always the ones I made to myself. During dinner I found myself sitting beside a gentleman named Harold. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his smile carried the warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime encouraging others. He asked about my work. When I explained furniture restoration, his eyes lit up. "My wife used to say, 'Old furniture teaches patience.'" What did she mean? He looked thoughtfully across the room. "You can't rush careful work." He smiled gently. "The same is true of people." Later, as volunteers cleared the tables, Harold introduced me to several neighbors I'd seen for years but never truly met. One repaired bicycles for children, another organized food parcels for elderly residents, someone else taught free music lessons every Thursday. I realized how many remarkable people had quietly existed just beyond the walls I'd built around myself. The following weekend Emily invited Oliver and me to help with the library's annual book fair. Hundreds of donated books filled folding tables across the town square. Families wandered between stalls searching for unexpected treasures. Children proudly carried stacks of colorful picture books almost as tall as themselves. Emily handed me a box. "These belong on the history table." "I think you've mistaken me for someone organized." She grinned. "I know exactly who you are." There was something reassuring about hearing those words. Not because I believed I had everything figured out, but because someone had chosen to see the best in me before I fully saw it myself. By midday the square was full. An elderly woman hesitated beside the classics section, looking increasingly confused. I walked over. "Can I help?" She smiled apologetically. I promised my grandson I'd buy him the book his grandfather loved. "Do you remember the title?" She frowned. "I remember it had an island and treasure." Her face brightened. "Yes." Within minutes we found it. She held the book carefully, almost reverently. "My husband used to read this aloud every winter." She smiled through shining eyes. "Now perhaps my grandson will hear the same story." As she walked away, Emily quietly appeared beside me. "You've become very good at noticing." I smiled. "I had an excellent teacher." She shook her head. "I simply reminded you of something that was already there." Her words echoed those she'd spoken weeks earlier outside the chapel. "I never needed you to become someone different." Those words had slowly become something I carried with me. Near the end of the afternoon, Oliver climbed onto the small stage to thank the volunteers. He wasn't naturally shy, but public speaking always made him nervous. Predictably, halfway through his speech he completely lost his place. The crowd waited patiently. Oliver scratched his head. "I had a very inspiring ending planned." Everyone laughed. "So I'll simply say thank you." He looked toward Emily, then toward me. "And remember that communities aren't built by famous people." He smiled warmly. "They're built by neighbors who keep showing up." The applause lasted much